At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs. Welcome everyone to another Drug Science Podcast. This is me, David Nutt, and today we're doing a podcast on medical cannabis. And specific reason for that is that in a couple of days' time, the Medical Cannabis Awareness Week will be starting. And we thought it would be important for those of you who are interested in this field, which is, we know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions in the country, to have an update from people who are working actively in the field and also campaigning to get improved access and also policy change. So I'm going to welcome two guests, and we may even have a third one later. So firstly, I'll introduce Callie Seaman. Callie, hello.
Pleased to be here today.
And then Dr. Leon Barron, who will also tell you about what he's doing as a prescriber. So, Callie, do you want to kick off? Tell us why you're on this panel with us and what your interests are and what you're doing.
So I'm the co-chair of the Cannabis Industry Council in the UK, and I've had a passion about cannabis for over 20 years now. I originated from the hydroponic industry, working with legal licensed cultivation facilities within the UK and internationally. My passion's always been about plants and plant medicines, and I originally started off working for GlaxoSmithKline in their research and development department, and soon found that it wasn't for me and it wasn't my cup of tea. But I always had this passion around it. And this really came from when I was diagnosed with epilepsy at the age of 15. And I was introduced to cannabis by my father to help control my seizures, or to help to keep them under control. So that's really my passion. I now currently work with a number of different licensed facilities, working on product development and actually optimizing the crops that they are producing. It's a fascinating industry to be in. It's very much in its infancy at the moment. We've got lots of trials and tribulations going off, and there's obviously a lot of change that's needed, but it's thanks to people like yourself speaking out, David Nutt, about the way that the law is and how these things need changing in order for us to take this forwards.
Well, thanks, Callie, and thanks for sharing. I hadn't realised you had such a knowledgeable and foresighted father. How did he come to that insight?
Well, it was word of mouth. It was anecdotal. This was 1995. I mean, we've not even really isolated a lot of the many cannabinoids or being able to actually detect it. And when I did my degree in biomedical sciences, all cannabis was talked about was detecting it in urine or detecting it in blood because somebody had been misusing or caught drug driving. You weren't taught anything about the endocannabinoid system. It didn't even exist back then. So it was more of a try this, it's going to help to calm things down, but we had no hard data or anything on it. It was just an anecdotal kind of information.
And are you still using?
Yes.
You don't have to answer, obviously. But
yes, I am. I've been using for over 25 years now. I realised how prominent and how effective it was when I was actually doing my PhD and stopped. And made the decision, right, I'm going to complete my PhD. I'm writing up, right, let's clear my head. And the seizures came back, which could have been to do with the stress as well at the same time. I'm not going to over promote cannabis as being this complete panacea, but it certainly helps control my seizures. It certainly helps with my sleep. It helps with my anxiety. So, yeah, it was kind of more of an accident of finding out how effective it was.
And I suppose you're living proof that having taken it now for that's over 20 years, isn't it? You haven't grown an extra pair of limbs. You haven't gone psychotic.
No. I'm a little bit mad at times, but who isn't?
It helps, I think. Well, at least that's my motto. Well, great. Now let's move over to Leon. How did you get interested in medical cannabis and what are you doing now?
Right. So I'm a GP by background and was plodding along, 2017, 2018, rather frustrated, actually, a little bit frustrated with my work. I was very sort of heavily in the NHS and 10-minute appointments and conveyor belt medicine, as I like to think of it, a little bit. It's very intense. And I came across medical cannabis really through the media campaigns that were running at the time. This was around epilepsy in children. And by rather coincidence, I went to the first ever meeting that Professor Barnes put together for it was an education event really in London. And I think this was just as the law changed. And Mike was there, and he spoke and brought some excellent speakers. I remember a chap from David Finn, was it, from Ireland, and really interesting presentations.
Little call out there. Can I give a little shout out to Finn?
Yeah,
one of my best ever
absolutely.
PhD students.
There you go.
Although we didn't work on cannabis. He got wise and moved into that field. But carry on. He's a lovely guy.
Yeah, no, I just, look, to sum it up, David, I went to a conference early on and I met patients at the event. I met academics. And then I heard about family members overseas, actually, who were being prescribed cannabis on prescription and done remarkably well. And it was a bit of a eureka moment. For me, it was like, I always felt that being in medicine, it was very unlikely in my career that something big would come along, like it perhaps did if you graduated in the 1950s or the 60s or the 70s. There were big steps forwards, right? And I used to think to myself, oh, I don't know, maybe I'll go and work on a receptor somewhere or something, some niche kind of clinical trial and contribute something to the greater good. But this came along and I thought, no, actually, this is super interesting. It's massive. This is going to become very mainstream in time. The more I learned about it, I realized how effective it is as a medicine, how safe it is, how useful it is. And I just became very interested in it. Really had to do a lot of my own learning. Mike set up the MCCS at that time. I was one of the early members. And we built it into a really very trustworthy, large organization. We've got around 500 members now. We've got international experts. We work collaboratively across the board. We work closely with the industry, with CIC and patient groups. But I've always felt that we need to, rather than work in isolation, reach out to international expert people that perhaps know a bit more than we do in the UK, and just sort of normalise the conversation and train doctors and make them feel like there's a safe space for them to operate in that sense. So my work really to date has largely been focused on education in the medical cannabis space. And I do some prescribing as well. I'm working at the London Resilience Clinic, which is Dr. Danny Gordon's clinic. Some of our listeners might know. Really interesting work, actually, and I'm seeing the benefits of prescribing, and particularly for slightly more complex patients, or those who have conditions that often are intertwined or overlapping. So common conditions for us would be managing fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, long COVID. What else do we do? All kinds of things. But, it's a really good tool for patients that perhaps haven't improved with more traditional, conventional treatments. So, yeah, it's been very enjoyable to date, very satisfying work. Lots of obstacles along the way, and I'm sure we'll maybe discuss those in a bit more detail. But yeah, really, really, I think there's so much in it and so much potential to improve patients' lives and help people. So, yeah.
And how many GPs are in that group?
We could have something like 30 or 40, 50 maybe GPs.
Well, that's good. That's got a voice. I mean, I'll just throw this out to both of you, really, because we've just set up this afternoon another all-party parliamentary group on medical cannabis, trying to keep beating the drum for some kind of more rational approach and to stop this absurd block of prescribing in the NHS. I mean, I'm interested in both your opinions on this. We're arguing, with the drug science hat on, are arguing that if GPs were allowed to prescribe, then that would really move the dial in the direction of access. But of course, people say, well, there's no GPs don't know anything about it because they're not allowed to prescribe. They're not been trained. But 50 is quite a reasonable number. I mean, I guess if once you started prescribing, that would snowball. Do you think?
Well, There are GPs prescribing already in some of the private clinics. I happen to be one of them.
Can I just jump in there? Are you on shared care with that? Is that a shared care?
Yeah, so for those that don't know, the initial script has to be initiated by a specialist. Most of the specialists prescribing in the UK are either psychiatrists or pain specialists. Neurologists are prescribing, a few others, but predominantly it's psychiatry-led and pain specialists. But once the initial script's been issued, yes, you can re-prescribe. And look, I mean, I've spoken about this at length in the past, but I honestly believe that if GPs were allowed to prescribe, they would, and we'd see quite a large uptake actually. So it's not a sort of lack of interest necessarily. It's just that for most doctors working in the NHS, it's not an option, and it's not an easy thing to get into. But I've certainly seen the conversation change over the years. I think GPs are much more open to it than they used to be, much more accepted. They're referring more commonly into the private clinics, into the private space, and they're seeing the results. So, although we might only have a smaller number of members in the society, I don't think that's a reflection of what the GP workforce would look like if they could actually prescribe, even if it was initially just in a private capacity. I think that would really open up prescribing. But yeah, it's certainly unique. I mean, we don't see this in any other country where cannabis has been legalized. It's very odd. I mean, there's no rationale behind it, really.
No, I've often said it was giving with one hand and taking away with the other. And I'd be interested in both your observations. You got this, as you say, total paradox. We have as on the surface as liberal a prescribing regime as anywhere, because we don't constrain it to any diagnosis, but we do constrain it to specialists who don't want to prescribe it. I suspect that was probably an accident. I mean, I tend to believe, having spent a lot of time having dialogue with people in government and the civil service, it's probably more cock up than conspiracy. But whatever it is, it's definitely been very, very destructive. And how do we change it? What do you think, Kelly? I mean, are your organisations trying to do that?
Yes, I mean, it's about removing the stigma. I think a lot of, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, when I did a degree in biomedical sciences, all cannabis was mentioned and cannabinoids were mentioned were a drug of abuse. And we need to get rid of that kind of mindset that this is a medicine. This is something that can be used every day for very simple kind of ailments, painkillers, to reduce down the amount of opiates that are being used, to actually trade off on something else. I think education's part of it, removing the stigma and us talking more about it. It is about us talking about it. It's something I'm trying to do with all of my healthcare workers. One of the most interesting things was that it was my dentist that was most interested and wanted to actually know a lot more than my GP. My GP was a little kind of dismissive of it, but there's this kind of image that it's people sitting at home, eating pizza, playing on PlayStations, and it's a drug of abuse. And it's not. It helps so many people. At the CIC, we've got an awareness campaign, and I think we need to sort of approach it that everybody can use this. This isn't gang culture that's associated with it, and I think this is probably one of the hardest things we've got to get past, that there's this that's associated with gangsters and rappers, and we need to get it so that an old lady isn't ashamed. She's not ashamed that she's using cannabis to help treat her arthritis. She's not ashamed of this. And I spent many years ashamed of my consumption. I hid it until my son was 16, and that just shows you what one of the big issues, that we need to remove that shame surrounding something that is simply a plant but has so many medicinal properties. We've got to educate the doctors as well, and this is what the work you're doing, Leon, is fantastic, and taking that forwards, where other doctors can share what they've been doing, share their stories, understand how to prescribe and how to look for cannabis use disorder as well. I mean, it is an amazing drug, but what we also have to accept is there are side effects. We can't ignore those, but we need to be able to have forums where people can discuss that so that we can be ready for those. So when you're talking to a patient, you're confident in the way that they're prescribing. They're confident in any kind of issues that the patient brings to them that they're experiencing with, whatever product they're using. The doctor has the answer and is ready to say, oh, well, maybe we need to try a different cultivar. Maybe we need to try something a little bit different with a little bit of a different mix of cannabinoids in there. At the moment, everyone's really focused on THC and CBD, and there's so much more to cannabis. We all know that here. There's so much more to it. And we need to just get the education out there.
I suppose the place to start really is the medical school, but it's proving, I mean, pharmacology has been squeezed. I remember when I was a medical student, it was one of the core subjects. Now it's a kind of couple of weeks in the 5 years, and obviously it's with got very little access to those courses. And I don't know. Presumably, most training now in medical therapeutics is done at the postgraduate level, is it, Leon? I mean,
Well, I think back to how it was.
Is it on your curriculum?
I'm not closely in touch. I do a little bit of teaching at UCL undergrad, but I don't know the extent of pharmacology.
I'm not sure I don't think any undergraduate medicine does medical cannabis.
I mean, it should be. It should be, of course. From what I've heard, there are some universities that are now including it in the curriculum. I mean, it's such a huge topic. It's extensively researched. It's bizarre, really. But it comes back to what Callie said. There's this sort of childish view on cannabis for those that don't understand it. Although I think it's changing, actually. I think I'm starting to see a shift now.
I think there's some academic snobbery as well. And I'm going to say it because in this country, we do have this, we hold our universities in high, astute. We really do see that we're higher than the rest of the world. And all the research that's happened in the US, if you search for peer-reviewed journals on cannabinoids with any kind of ailment, there is hundreds, if not thousands of papers out there. But yet still here, that's not good enough. That's not, and we need to get past that. I think we need to get past as well the type of studies that we need to do. A lot within this country, in order to get a drug to actually onto the market, requires randomized controlled trials. Now, cannabis really just doesn't fit into that. It's polypharmacology. We've got a number of different cannabinoids all working in together in unison, what's known as the entourage effect, which doesn't fit into this model. Real world evidence needs to be used. And there's been some fantastic papers come out of drug science around that. And we really need to get that accepted as the gold standard when it comes to studies around cannabis, because it really just doesn't fit into this model that we're so obsessed with randomized controlled trials. I think we do need to see a change in this kind of mindset of how we're doing things.
So, and that mindset, though, is, we've kind of painted ourselves into a bit of a corner in terms of education, because it's something that the general public seem to they know the term RCT. They don't quite know what it means, but they know it is, and they often say, well, without RCT, they don't believe unless there's an RCT, and actually re-educating doctors as well as the public that RCTs are actually just one small facet of evidence gathering is hugely difficult. It's become almost a religion, and I don't know what to do. That's one of the reasons I want to have this conversation with you, because who makes a decision? MHRA said, I think at least 5 years ago, they were going to look at real world evidence, but they haven't told us how to do that. I don't think they've ever approved a drug just on real world evidence and I kind of feel that we've almost lost the ability to think outside of the sort of the traditional, let's get a patent, let's do an RCT, let's get approval model, which, as you've pointed out, isn't going to happen with medical cannabis. So we need to think more creatively. But how do we get the MHRA and the chief medical officer to do that? I don't know.
I think we look around the world. I think we see what the rest of the world's been doing and how they're doing. I think we need to stop thinking that our trials and our research is higher than everybody else's. I think we really need to say, hold on a minute, let's see what Germany's doing and how they're moving forwards. Let's see how they actually approach this and the data that's being produced. I mean, the safety profile on cannabis is amazing. I mean,
Yes,
it hasn't got an LD50.
Except we had Professor Whitty saying to a select committee just a year or so ago that, you couldn't license medical cannabis because it might be like another thalidomide. And you think, kind of, that does betray a considerable ignorance about the use of cannabis over many thousands of years. I don't know. Is it willful ignorance? Is it just incompetence? I don't know. But I'm kind of pessimistic until we get someone in and leading us who can think differently. And at least Sally Davis did say, yeah, of course it's a medicine, but only specialists can prescribe it, whereas Whitty doesn't even seem to think it's a medicine. But who knows? Maybe he'll move on. But I'm interested in where colleges stand. I mean, and I think your college, Leon, is potentially the most
UCL.
the one that's got most to benefit from it. Is there any movement within the RCGPs to change things?
No, not within the RCGP, no. And in fact, their e-learning is somewhat subpar, in my opinion. But let's not dwell on that for too long. Going back to the data, I don't know if we're sort of reaching a bit of a tipping point in science and traditional ways of gathering data. Hello, Michael, by the way, I can see who's joined. I'm thinking more widely, right? Is there anything that's similar to cannabis or anything that you can't quite pinpoint into these RCTs? And I'm just thinking out loud that the gut health areas become huge, right? And that's very kind of broad data sets. But there are companies that we know of, right? Big companies that are collecting this very rich data that's individualized. It has remarkable, I think, long-term, like it's very robust data when you start to pool it into sort of large groups and so on. And I think there's some similarities with medical cannabis, and actually we may find that with AI and large data sets and working collaboratively that we produce such compelling data that actually we no longer have to kind of beg for approval from the sort of more standard regulatory steps that we're used to going through. And I'm not saying that they've necessarily a problem, but they do seem to be a problem with medical cannabis. And I just wonder with the kind of the way that some of the better companies are looking at collecting data on their products, and obviously things like T21, overseas data on cannabis and health tech and that sort of thing. I just wonder if we'll kind of come to it through a different route, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud.
Well, I think we have to. But it does require people having an open mind, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I think we need a whole new pathway. And I think we almost need to, we don't need to try and fit this square peg into this round hole. We need to create more of a botanical pathway, which there is one. But cannabis is so unique. It's not like any other medication that we're seeing. And I think we need to look at creating that new.
Well, no, because it's marginally more effective than most other botanicals. That's the thing. It's a real medicine. Well, this is a good point to bring in Michael. Michael, hello. Welcome. Do you want to introduce yourself and introduce Somai?
Yeah, my name's Mike Sassano. I'm the CEO of Somai Pharmaceuticals, and thanks for having me on, guys.
So yes, tell us about Somai, because I think you're going to be joining we're hoping you're going to join the T21 initiative. Tell us about what your why and what your ambitions are.
I mean, of course, we're longtime supporters of T21, and so we continue to want to support the UK markets and its patients. I mean, long-term ambitions. That's a long ball you're throwing at me. I'm not sure where to go with that.
Well, I think starting in getting it. Obviously you're in Germany for some purpose, aren't you? Just reflect on the difference between Germany and the UK, which Callie's just been already pointing out. What have you learned from your trip to Germany then?
Well, as you might know, I spend 90% of my year traveling around and talking to doctors and pharmacists and clinics and groups around the world. And so I think to your discussion that you were just having about the new pathway, Germany took cannabis off the narcotics list. And, this would be also comparable to what I've been writing about the USA going to a Schedule 3 drug. And, getting with the times and understanding the safety and the benefit, has obviously been a struggle for, I mean, at least the 17 years I've been in the business. And so these are steps in the right direction. And so the German market is exploding at the seams. And there's some bad and some good, I would imagine, with that. I think public sentiment isn't as positive as it would be since the legalization, but on the other side, there's a lot of positive to access, to the for the patients and for the doctors to practice the medicine they want. And so you hear going around, I've been actually to 4 different states and cities in a matter of a few days. And I actually passed through from one place to Hanover, stopped there for a meeting, and then passed through to get to Berlin for meetings tomorrow. And each place is a very similar story. They're looking for better supply lines that they can be comfortable in. They're looking to forge relationships because the current supply lines are not satisfactory to the surge that Germany has seen. You're seeing doubles, if not triples, in some areas. And so, in volume increase of prescriptions and demand, you're seeing a $450 million market, euro market, sorry, that's trending to $1 billion right now. And that's surely going to grab the attention of regulators and politicians because now you're talking about 190 million in taxable base. And so, regardless of what we feel from a patient's perspective, politicians seem to be there pulling the strings in the background, of all of this and slowing down the access. And I think Germany is going to be a stark reminder that you can open up access, and there'll be positives and negatives, but the volumes and the access to patients is incredible right now. And so I think you're going to even find that ancillary countries along the way are going to pay attention to this model and decide what's better for them, prohibition and illicit market access, or increasing the doctor's ability to prescribe in a more liberal, let's say, fashion.
Yes, but I mean, you can see arguments both ways. Having an open recreational market could deflect people away from medicine because they, I suppose, don't seek medical advice. They just self-medicate. But I guess we'll find out in time what's happened there.
But it is a medical market. This is not a recreational market at all. Just to be clear, the few social clubs are an experiment that are pretty much laughed at as a lowering of quality. I don't subscribe to the recreational appeal in any market, really. So, from the medical perspective, this is where we're seeing the drive. These social clubs are just a bad experiment, and everybody's realizing that now. So, I wouldn't even pay attention too much to that because all you hear about is failures and people having to work and garage style growing, pesticidal issues. Once you can't control your quality standard, you're just going backwards in time.
So there you are. You're obviously not, I don't think you're British or German. So what's reflecting on our two countries? Why do you think they're so different in terms of their attitude?
I wrote a piece on
You can be as frank as you like. You can be absolutely as frank as you like, because I don't think any of the three of us Brits here are particularly pro the British model. Put it that way.
I mean, I think the Germans were more passionate about pushing this forward. We're trying to get passion out of the UK. If you look at the stats on people's desires to legalize or make a little bit more accessible cannabis, medical cannabis, I think there's not much excitement on either side of the aisle, on the political sphere, right? And then they're reading numbers like it's going to be a multi-billion-dollar industry, and they're saying, well, great, we're on a great track, why should we change anything? But the reality is $110 million euro market, or 120, and still limited access and drive. And so I think that's another function of political will. And I wrote an article about different markets and access to cannabis, both illicit and legally. And one of the things that I point out for the UK market is it's quite easy to get any drug you want online and have delivered right to your home or your hotel, even as a tourist. And that's quite shocking, that's prolific. yet the medical market has to suffer. Similar to even Spain, you have 2,000 social clubs that are illicit market, yet we're just finally getting legalized medical cannabis to the patients. And so I think that malaise or that non-excitement to change the attitude is where it's at.
Do you think the NHS is to blame? In fact, we have really one massive provider. I mean, clearly, all medical cannabis in this country, with the exception, I think, of 5 prescriptions, are outside the NHS. I mean, that's a question to the three of you.
Well, I think it was funny at the weekend. I was with friends and her mother-in-law is German. And I think it's our attitude here. We're not accepting to pay for our healthcare here. It's not we've not got that attitude of, well, I've got a problem, I need to pay.
Well, we are paying, but we're not. We don't have much autonomy over it. Obviously, we're paying because we pay in national insurance contributions, but people don't see it as paying because they're not making an active. It's a compulsory payment rather than a choice, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not something we seem to invest in. We don't have the attitude to invest in this country.
Well, you don't. Well, you can't. You can't invest. You can only pay. There's no flexibility.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think this through. I mean, I think doctors have become, I don't like to make sweeping generalizations at all, but I think we do have a bit of an issue in the UK with doctors that sort of practice really alongside guidelines or what NICE says is right. Okay, and if you step outside of the UK and look at us, I think Australia is a good example. So loads of British doctors go and work over there. You sort of get some feedback about what they do, and they seem to have a bit more autonomy. They're prepared to sort of maybe try things out for people that are perhaps struggling a bit or could do something a bit off license, or use the art of medicine really, which was always the appeal of becoming a doctor. It certainly was for me. And I think we've become entrenched in kind of red tape, flow charts. And actually what NICE says is right or wrong, or what they advise really is through the eyes of the NHS and cost effectiveness. And it might not always be what's the best medicine for someone or most effective medicine. So I think it's kind of, so to get back to your original question, yes, I do think it's a bit of a problem, the NHS, because it influences doctors so heavily in the way they prescribe or the way they think about medicine at times. And yeah, the public sector's maybe sort of less, it's perhaps just more for those that can afford it or are prepared to kind of, pay for their medicine and step outside the NHS. I do think it plays into things somewhat. Yeah, those are my initial thoughts.
But you saw. I mean, we have. I mean, maybe Michael wasn't part of this, but I mean, the rest. 2 days ago, we had this new government launched a massive initiative. 300 leaders of international businesses. Eli Lilly coming here to sort out our obesity problem. The NHS really enthusiastic about this. And you think, guys, I'm sorry, but who's deciding which are the major issues to deal with? And it doesn't. It does seem as though our patients with pain, patients with psychiatric disorders, they get a bit marginalised still. And we talk the talk, but we don't actually walk the walk in terms of helping those, do we?
I'm glad you brought the economics into it, because we've just literally a joint paper. In fact, David, you'll have seen that the emails going round about it in the review, expert review of pharmacoeconomics on the cost effectiveness of cannabis for the treatment of pain using the T21 data, and it actually concluded that it was cost effective when in comparison to other medication, and we've actually proved that it's more cost effective to use cannabis-based medicines. And once that's freely available, the paper will get that out and so everyone can actually have a look at this to understand that it shouldn't be just about the cost, because it is cost effective.
Right. And on top of that, there's also this remarkable finding in T21 of people just giving up using opiate analgesics because they don't need them anymore. If you set up a program to try to get people off opiate analgesics, you'd never achieve the success that has happened just by giving people a better drug. I mean, it's remarkable, and it should be celebrated. But again, we don't seem to have that interest. And to be honest with all of you, I'm not entirely sure who would make the decision that GPs can prescribe? Maybe, Leon, do you know whose desk would that decision?
Well, I know it's a government decision. Doesn't need to go through like Privy Council or something like that.
I don't know. I don't know.
Oh no. You know, the other way to it is there's been a conversation for some years about putting GPs on the specialist register.
Uh-huh.
That would be a different way to.
Yeah, that would be a good way because you guys are specialists.
Yeah,
You do exams these days, don't you? Right. Yeah.
exactly. So that's the other way. You know, if the statutory law can't be amended, or it's not going to be because there's no appetite from government. I do know that there's a debate that's been going on for some time now amongst the RCGP, I think, and the wider GP community, that GP should be perhaps on the specialist register and not on this separate GP register on the GMC. That would be a way to actually get there.
That would be a way. That would add a stroke, wouldn't it? That would be a good out.
And it's less focused on cannabis, of course.
Yeah,
which is probably a good thing in this context. So that's one thing. But yeah,
but it would also be good to reschedule as well. I think that would take a lot of. I mean, some of the anxiety and certainly some of the complexity in terms of prescribing is due to the schedule.
Yeah,
which is completely unwarranted, as I think we'd all agree. Michael, given we've been talking more than you, are there any other observations you want to make as someone who's trying to innovate and introduce new products into this country?
I think my perspective, because we address multiple countries, I try to work within the framework of what that country deals with, the regulator deals with. And I had an interesting story that occurred recently, and along the lines of what we're talking about. And I had mentioned to them about the HHS 252-page report, which I keep, repeating in my writing on a continual basis. And I pointed out that the HHS, FDA of the U.S., has after 2 decades.
HHS is Health and Human Services,
Yeah,
is
it's
that right?
a division of the FDA. And so they put out in January, they begrudgingly, through what's called the Freedom of Information Act. It's a way for citizens to sue to get documentation. And they had to put out this report. And it ultimately concluded, and I'll use their words, it's safe. Cannabis is safe. Cannabis is safer than current sleeping medications and pain medications. And they point out benzos and oxycodons and things of this nature. And then it goes on to say it's safest for overdose reactions, and then goes on to define overdose reaction as an adverse reaction. And then it continues on and says it's good for at least the word least 15 indications. And this regulator says, well, that's not our country. And I looked at him and I said, but this is 2 decades of data that they cite 6 million patients and 30,000 prescribing physicians. Like, how can that be ignored? And they said, well, we're going to have to develop our own data. And I of course, respected that opinion. But, at some point, like, how many decades would it take to assemble that kind of data point to make those kind of conclusions? And so I am scratching my head a little bit at not the inability for countries to share information about the safety and efficacy for specific uses of cannabis. And, that's what I'm faced with on a daily basis.
I think that's what we would call willful denial. It was the old Nelson trick of putting the telescope to the blind eye. That's choosing to ignore the evidence. Nowhere else in science would you ignore evidence. But of course, politics, drug policy is political, and cannabis has been unfortunately a victim of the anti-drug rhetoric, and patients are suffering. So how can we facilitate our patients having more of a voice? What do you think, Callie?
I think we just need to listen to them. I think we need to take on board what real world evidence is, lived experiences. I think we need to encourage people to share their experiences and the data as well, and collect that data. We also need cannabis naive patients. We need a lot more of those to be feeding into this, to really give the confidence to the doctors that it isn't just somebody who is using cannabis as a soother. They actually see the difference that they went from not using cannabis to using it, and seeing those real differences that they have with the quality of life. I mean, there's lots of things that are already happening out there. There's a lot of patient groups that are listening. We've got Medcam Family Foundation. We've got a number of different kind of patient groups that are coming together and sharing these experiences. The CIC itself also has a patients group as well, so that we can communicate what the patients' needs are and the problems they have back to industry as well, so they can feed that back in and help to improve. We haven't really talked much about sort of the domestic supply and the lack of domestic supply that we've got in this country, and a number of the different facilities I've worked with, and the red tape they've got to go through, because that's going to give patients again the confidence that I'm not consuming something that's travelled halfway around the world. It's actually been produced within this country.
Yes, and we know we can do that because it was funding one of our drugs ministers' homes for a while, wasn't it? But anyway, yeah, I think you've raised a very important point in my mind, and I'll take that back to T21 next week when we meet. But we haven't systematically studied outcomes in naive patients, and we've got plenty. We should do that. We should prioritise that. Thank you for flagging that up.
Yeah, it is something that I feel is going to give us that robust data, that data you cannot pick one hole in. A naive patient and a group of those seeing that, giving that hard facts around the effectiveness of this medication.
Yeah, no, and the safety as well. Yes, quite. So, Leon, we're going to have to wrap it up now. Any other final comments, observations from someone who's actually fighting to write prescriptions and dealing with all that bureaucracy?
Yeah, going back to the previous point about not kind of education, really, like people that I talk to day to day who are in this space don't really understand much about cannabis. A lot of people don't know it's legal on prescription. They don't really understand the difference between CBD, medical cannabis on prescription. So it's quite remarkable, really, how we're 5 years in and people don't even know it's an option for them. So I know the CIC have looked at this numerous times, but some sort of education piece is always a good thing. And then we obviously have to do the same approach, but different type of education for medical schools and doctors, which we're sort of trying to do. We've got a student elective now through the MCCS, so every year we have a medical student or couple, and that's going very well. So yeah, we've got sort of student ambassadors and people on the ground, so to speak. So yeah, we're slowly making some progress in that sense. But yeah, I'd say that's probably the main. There's a limit to what we can do, because as we've discussed, there's lots of red tape and lots of things that prevent us kind of the market opening up more widely. But I think probably comes down to education, talking about it more.
Well, don't forget to mention my book, which I think is here.
Of course.
There.
Yeah.
Cannabis. Maybe we should give it to every MP.
No, I've read that. It's excellent.
Maybe I should do that.
Every MP, yeah.
Send a copy to every MP.
Well,
I'm going to leave you with the last words, Michael.
Yeah, just parlaying off of that, the education, getting the word out and opening up more demographics is really the job out there. They have in every country. If you go to specific websites where you can get educated, it's very limited and sometimes very difficult to understand the legal framework of that country. And so even my 80-year-old parents and their whole entire community that they live in, to one degree, are using cannabis at different levels for different indications. And it could be as simple as arthritis, where their medications haven't been working very well for them. And so that's their specific use. And so, if the 80-year-old my parents who aren't really savvy on the internet, can figure it out, because there's enough educational tools and doctors that are willing to explain it to them, because they're not going to go to your local bud tender and talk to them. They want to talk to their doctor how this interacts with their medication, and then the doctors that are more educated are able to explain to them, look, this is the effect of the current medications you're on and how the cannabis is going to interact or not interact. And that's really important, because I don't think they would have gotten relief for a lot of things. Well, I'm in the business, obviously. They're educated in that way, but they don't get advice from me. They have advice from their doctors who are medicating them for other things. So, as that builds out, I think the universe gets exponentially larger. And as more products come online, and it's hard, like Australia has 1,000 different SKUs, it's almost confusing, but these extra SKUs reach different demographics, because not everybody, my parents are not going to smoke flower, and they have their own a way of consuming cannabis that they enjoy.
Yeah. Well, that's actually something that this government wants to encourage. I just hope that they actually walk the walk, having started talking the talk. So, but you can be reassured that we're all going to be definitely banging on those doors, trying to make them listen. As I said, the APPG Medical Cannabis Group has started again, and we will be presenting T21 data there next time. And I will dig out and look at the data on naive patients. I think that could be very reassuring to those doom mongers who fear that they're all going to become dependent and psychotic. And I can say we've not found any evidence of anyone in T21 having psychotic reactions at all. It's been remarkably well tolerated. By the way, all listeners, I also say now that if you go onto the Drug Science website, there's an enormous amount of literature available. There are multiple papers that Callie's mentioned that Drug Science has produced. They're all freely available, freely downloadable from the Drug Science website. And there's also, if you are in the teaching arena, there are a series of wonderful slides on medical cannabis going from the receptor, the endogenous substances, right through to clinical use. So, and they're all free again. So do use Drug Science as your resource. Look, thank you all. Let's go away and celebrate at this Medical Cannabis Week and keep up the good work. So thanks again to the three of you.
Thank you, everyone.